Calgaro, and this summer I worked with Nirala Singh in Professor McFarland's lab, producing and characterizing doped titanium oxide for regenerable hydrobromic acid fuel cells. So what is a regenerable fuel cell in the first place? Well, as we're moving towards more renewable resources such as solar and wind energy, we want to be able to store the electricity formed by these sources. Because as you know, solar energy only produces electricity during the day. And the only way to keep this electricity and the only way to use the electricity at nighttime is to store it. But storing pure electricity is really hard. It's literally keeping lightning in a bottle. So one way to keep electricity is to convert it into chemical energy through the use of a regenerable fuel cell. So what this fuel cell does is it takes a reactant, hydrobromic acid, and runs electricity through it and converts the hydrobromic acid into hydrogen and bromine. And then when you want the electricity back, you just run the reaction backwards and get out your electricity. The key component of any fuel cell is the electrode. It's what brings electricity to the cell. So the electrode has to be conductive, it has to bring in the electricity, and it has to be stable. Hydrobromic acid is a really strong acid, and it corrodes almost every type of electrode you try to put it in. One exception is titanium. It doesn't corrode titanium actively, so it doesn't disintegrate it. Instead, it forms titanium oxide, which is unfortunate because titanium oxide is really resistive, so it drastically lowers the amount of electricity entering the cell and extremely drops the efficiency of our cell. So what I'm trying to do is dope titanium oxide with some other metal that will make it more conductive and make the fuel cell more efficient. So what I did is I made a whole bunch of different metal doped titanium oxides and then tested them on high throughput screening. And so what that allows me to do is take all my metal oxides and test them all at once and then just look at them and see which ones are active and which ones aren't active. And then once I find the ones that are active, I'm comparing them to other electrodes like titanium oxide itself, platinum, which is a very good working electrode in fuel cells, and electrographite, which is another commonly used electrode in fuel cells. And then at the end, I want to find the optimum dopant that will have the best activity and be the best electrode for the fuel cells. So what I did is I made my metal oxides on carbon powder support. So I took metal chloride precursors, put them on carbon, baked them in the oven at 350 degrees Celsius, and so they calcined and crystallized. And then I took those powders and made them into metal oxide inks. And I deposited the inks on my electrode and ran electricity through it and looked for bromine evolution in my cyclical tamogram. So bromine evolution is yellow, and when I saw which ones turned yellow, I tested those again on another electrode individually, so then I could get another cyclical tamogram, and this time actually get quantitative results and compare them to each other and to electrographite and platinum. And so at the same time, I wanted to characterize the stability of my metal oxides, because if they're really conductive but really unstable, then they're totally useless because they're not going to last very long. So what I did is I took all my different metal oxides and put them in a 3 molar hydrobromic acid bath for 3 weeks and took samples of my hydrobromic acid. Then I tested that solution with the inductively coupled atomic emission spectrometer and saw how much of the metal oxides dissolved into the solution. And the more metal oxide in solution, the less stable my electrode is. So what I found is that 2 metal oxides produced bromine in my high throughput screening test. Those were iron and ruthenium doped titanium oxide, and that the platinum electrode, which I was comparing to as a positive control, also evolved bromine, and so did the glassy carbon support. So if you look really, really closely, all 4 of those will turn yellow. And so as you can see, they all turn yellow, so I tested all of those again on a individual rotating disc electrode. And I found that when I added convection to the system, which wasn't present in my high throughput screening, that the differences in activity was a lot greater, so I could tell which ones were performing best. Platinum performed the best, which was expected since it's a high-performing electrode, but 10% ruthenium doped titanium oxide performed almost as well, and 5% iron, even though it didn't perform that much better, was a lot better than the glassy carbon support. So it might be a viable electrode because it's a lot cheaper than ruthenium oxide. So then I did my stability tests, and I found that, unfortunately, iron, which might have been a good electrode, was really unstable. A lot of it came out into the solution. Ruthenium, which was a pretty good electrode for activity, was also really stable, so it would be a good electrode. And chromium oxide, which didn't show any activity on my high throughput screening, was extremely stable, so stable that it couldn't even be measured by the ICP. So it was negative. There was less than 5 parts per billion in my solution. So it's super, super stable. And it might be promising depending on the activity of it. So I tested the activity again, this time comparing it to electrographite. And I found that although iron performed the best, 5% chromium doped titanium oxide performed almost as well. So it would be a really good type of electrode to use. And so in conclusion, I made my fuel cell using this chromium doped titanium oxide on a piece of carbon paper. And I found that in this fuel cell, it did produce bromine, so it would be active. The iron doped would have been a good choice, but it was unstable, so it's useless. Ruthenium also would have been a good choice if I need more activity because it was better performing than the chromium, but it's really expensive, so it might not be good. And chromium doped titanium oxide is the best one to use because it's cheap, it's pretty active, and it's extremely stable, so it won't need to be replaced in the hydrobromic acid fuel cell. So some future work would be to find the best concentration of chromium oxide and titanium oxide that has the best combination of stability and conductivity and activity, and to characterize that doped titanium oxide, find the crystal structure, make sure that I actually made doped titanium oxide because I'm not sure yet, and see what catalytic properties and what the surface structure looks like. And then finally make the actual electrode for a true hydrobromic acid fuel cell that can be used to store energy. So I'd like to thank Nirala for being such a great mentor, and Professor McFarland, who supported me and gave me lots of ideas like locating to chromium. And also the Stuckey Lab, because they let us use their millipore water, which was very helpful. Also to Erica and Maria Franco Aguilar, who is our version of Erica at UC Riverside. And to NSF, and the Office of the President for funding, and MRL for their use of the ICP machine.
How efficient are those fuel cells?
How efficient are they? Well, we're not really quite sure because we haven't tested the efficiency yet, and it's dependent on 2 things. So there's the bromine production and then the hydrogen production, and it's really dependent on which one is more efficient, and right now we don't know which one has the better activity. So whichever one is limiting determines the efficiency, and we don't know which one that is yet. Yes?
And the next slide, what's the bottom picture?
So this is actually, I think it's a SEM? It's a TEM of the electrode that is actually used on the hydrogen side. So what we're trying to do is look at this picture, take another picture like this for the chromium doped titanium oxide, and see if we can find these little spheres on it, which means that we actually made our doped material. Yes?
So is there any work being done to try and move away from HBr? I mean, you're correct, right? The HBr is a really strong acid.
So the reason we're using HBr versus something like water, which is pretty neutral, is because it's a really catalytic. The reaction is super, super fast and really catalytic, and it doesn't take as much electricity to run the reaction, and it has a much higher efficiency than water splitting fuel cells. So that's why we're actually looking at hydrobromic acid fuel cells. And also bromine, instead of evolving as a gas like hydrogen and oxygen, it's a liquid, so it's easier to like separate and then put back together.
In your stability studies, so you, how many hours did you study?
So this was over 3 weeks.
Oh, okay.
So yeah.
Okay, yeah, because I was gonna ask.
It's a
How
lot.
stable is it really, and sort of in a sense
So
where?
what I
actually
found is, I don't have a picture of it, but if you zoom in on like this for the first 24 hours, basically that's when it dissolves into solution, is in the first 24 hours, and after that it's pretty stable.
Do you, are there any plans to continue monitoring stability, and is there sort of a standard for how long these materials might need to be stable in a chemical?
So I think that you're all can correct me, but I think it needs to be stable for five years, because that's the lifespan of the other materials that you put in the fuel cell. So if it's stable for 5 years, then it's good. So I mean,
Come back and find out.
yeah, we'll find out. I'm not going to be here for 5 years.
So is there a way then to follow up with that? Is there a way to predict that? I mean, it's instead of, let's make one material and 5 years later.
5 years
like,
later,
man,
test
that
it.
sucks.
Like I'm sure there's ways to project like find the rate of decomposition and then project how much will be decomposed in or dissolved in 5 years.
Thank you.